Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us tonight. It is as the director of the Encountering Islam Initiative of the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas, it is my privilege to warmly welcome you to the keynote lecture of our 7th annual Terence Nichols Memorial Symposium. Thank you for taking the time to join us. This annual symposium is named in the memory and honor of Terence Nichols, an eminent professor in St. Thomas's Theology Department and a pioneer in the whole region for Muslim-Christian relations, who founded the Christian-Muslim Dialogue Center at the University of St. Thomas, of which the Encountering Islam Initiative is in many ways a humble continuation. The Encountering Islam Initiative is dedicated to creating awareness of Islam and seeks to present different Muslim voices and perspectives on a wide range of issues, and to facilitate Muslim-Christian engagement at the University of St. Thomas and in the broader area. In the symposium, we invite a resident scholar every year to address contemporary challenges and issues that may be important and relevant for both Muslims and Christians, as well as people of other traditions and perspectives, with the hope of initiating further mutual engagement, conversation, and action. This year, we are delighted to host Dr. Walid Al-Ansari, the Hilal Hisham and Leila Idris Al-Sawaidi University Chair of Islamic Studies at Xavier University in Ohio, where he teaches courses on comparative religion, Islamic studies, as well as religion and science. Dr. Al-Ansari holds a PhD in Islamic and religious studies from the George Washington University and an MA in economics from the University of Maryland. His research focuses on the intersection of religion, science, and economics. He has authored numerous publications, including Islamic Environmental Economics and the Three Dimensions of Islam in his co-edited volume, Muslim and Christian Understanding, Theory and Application of a Common Word. Other recently published articles include his Can Our Science and Economics Honor Nature in the inaugural issue of Renovatio, and Hindu and Muslim Economics on the need for a new economic paradigm, on a special issue of the Muslim World. His most recent book with Alexis Blum, Grand Rabbi Emeritus of New Delhi, and Bishop Claude Dagans, Bishop of Angoulême, is Knowing the Religion of the Other, which was arranged through the UNESCO-based Aladdin project to help train young rabbis, priests, preachers, and imams, as well as any other interested parties, about the Abrahamic traditions for greater mutual understanding and peace. The French and Arabic editions have been published, and the English edition is forthcoming. A Hebrew translation is underway, and the Vatican is also translating the book into Italian. On a personal note, it is great to see Dr. Ansari again. A long time from when we first met, when Dr. Ansari was a PhD candidate and I was a master's student at George Washington University. And he intrigued me then with his incisive critiques of neoclassical economic theory and the discussions of the merits of E.F. Schumacher, who's a famous Catholic economist and author of the book Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And he gave an alternative view of economics that was metaphysically, ethically, and spiritually rooted. And which blew my mind at that time. I was like, I hadn't heard a perspective of economics like that. So I hope to kind of get back into that conversation that started so many years ago with Dr. Ansari's presentation today. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Ansari. And afterwards, we will have question and answer. So please, some of you are my students or other professor students here, do ask questions. And all you're welcome. We'll have a good amount of time for questions. So please welcome Dr. Walid Al-Ansari.
Sorry, I need to turn this on. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Naeem. There's a supplication in Islam that when you have such a nice introduction like that you supplicate to God, and God help me live up to those expectations. Muslims begin things in the name of God. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of the infinite good and the ever merciful. I'd like to thank the Encountering Islam initiative of the Theology Department and the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Center for Interfaith Dialogue for inviting me and for sponsoring this. It's an honor and pleasure for me to be with you here tonight. I read President Vischer's inaugural address and was really impressed by his call to pursue truth, beauty, and goodness. And what I hope to share with you tonight will be very much related to that. Because I believe that the hallmark of a classical Christian or Islamic economy is that truth, beauty, and goodness were combined in the products that were made and in the way they were made. So I'd like to organize our discussion into three parts. First, what does a traditional Islamic or Christian economy look like? Second, what does this imply for a critique of industrial capitalism and communism? And third, what does this imply for economic theory? And the last section, the last question, will help explain why Islamic civilization never developed a discipline of economics in the modern sense, and despite tremendous economic activity that was flourishing in the Islamic world. And I believe that the spread of industrial and post-industrial market norms has affected the nature of work, which has generally ceased to be holistic. Holistic work is what we might call work that is spiritually, psychologically, and materially efficacious. In contrast to deformed work, which is only fulfills our material needs, but doesn't fulfill our psychological and spiritual needs. And that has sown the seeds of dissatisfaction. And I believe that's the underlying cause of many of the national and international social and economic problems of today, the most notable of which is the environmental crisis. So starting with the first question on what a traditional Islamic or Christian or other religious economy looks like, I believe that the cosmos, or God's art, you might say, simultaneously fulfills a hierarchy of spiritual, psychological, and material needs. And that this is a necessary condition for human arts and crafts to fulfill a hierarchy of needs for both the maker as well as the patron of the work. And from this point of view, the spiritual significance of the cosmos is really the basis of holistic work and a holistic economy. And these connections are quite apparent in Surah Al-Nahl, this chapter of the Bead of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam, which more than any other chapter of the Quran emphasizes the beauty and wonder of the natural world as signs of God. And or Ayat Allah, reflecting his names and qualities, which could be understood as vestigiae, as the counterpart in the Christian tradition in Catholic Latin. And the significance of nature from this point of view is therefore not reducible to its material benefits. And so, for example, verses 5 to 7 of this chapter state, "And cattle he has created for you, in which there is warmth and other uses, and whereof you eat. And in them there is beauty for you, when you bring them home and when you take them out to pasture. And they bear burdens to a land you would never reach, save with great hardship to yourselves. Truly your Lord is most kind." And so the cattle mentioned in this verse, when the Quran mentions cattle, it's used to designate four types of grazing animals: sheep, goats, camels, and oxen. And the many material benefits of them include their service as riding animals and beasts of burden, their provision of milk and meat, and their use of skin and wool for making dwellings and furnishings. But here the Quran invokes their beauty, jamal, as one of their benefits for us, and indicating that the natural world should be seen as a source of beauty and wonder, not just of material benefits. And so the same applies to horses and other riding animals in the next verse, which describes them as ornament in addition to highlighting the other essential services they render to us. And the Quranic emphasis on the beauty of nature as conveying signs for people who understand and who reflect clearly demonstrates that nature reveals a spiritual truth and presence from the Islamic or Christian or any other traditional religious point of view. Subsequent verses express similar principles regarding a hierarchy of spiritual and other needs in different contexts, such as seas, streams, the stars, which are dazzling in their beauty. But at the same time, it makes it possible for us to seek God's bounty by acquiring goods through distant trade by land or sea. And so you see how they're beautiful on one hand, but they are useful on the other. The two go together. And so since all creation reflects divine names and qualities, beauty has its source in ultimate reality. The beautiful, El-Jamil, is one of the names of God that radiates throughout levels of existence. And as human beings, we find our inner resonance with beauty, for it reminds us of our celestial origin, that origin whose memory we carry deep within our being and in which we recognize our true nature. By reading the signs and symbols, the Ayat Allah, or vestigial day, throughout creation, we gain in spiritual wisdom, ultimately realizing our potential as human beings made in God's image. And so the beauty of God that a symbol reflects also leads us back to Him. And so from this perspective, the cosmos itself is there to be read as if it were a boundless book, revealing multifaceted meanings and purpose placed therein by its author. It is the relationship between the cosmos, the Quran, and humankind that is central in Islam. And in a sense, it can be said that there are two Qur'ans, not just one. There's a Quran of Tadwini, which is the bound book that we read as Muslims, and there's the Book of Nature, which is a sacred text to be read as well. And so this would be analogous to Vestigia Day, as I mentioned before. And so the Quran itself refers to these signs in the verse, "We shall show them our importance upon the horizon and within themselves until it be manifest unto them that it is the truth." So the words and letters of the Quran, the elements of the macrocosmic creation surrounding us, and the microcosmic world within us, that is our faculties of intelligence and of the heart, all of these signs and symbols exist that we may perceive within them the divine message that they reveal. And just as the multiplicity of harmonious and connected forms of the natural world is filled with signs and symbols pointing to its creator, in a similar manner, the works created by human hands mirror the ultimate source of their creativity. And so beauty is therefore an essential part of what it means to be human. Just as the act of making things must fulfill a basic human need, the things that are produced, even those that are purely functional, should have an aspect of symbolism and beauty to them. Beauty is itself useful in the deepest sense. And as Emma Clark points out, even a glimmer of understanding of the Islamic and other religions' primordial arts and crafts reveals that their beauty is not simply a surface decoration, but is a reflection of a deep knowledge and understanding of the divine unity that penetrates all of our lives. Titus Burckhardt likewise explains the interconnections between art, beauty, and work through two sayings of the Prophet of Islam as follows: "God is beautiful and He loves beauty." This saying of the Prophet opens up limitless perspectives, not only for the inner life, where the beauty of God, where the beauty loved by God is above all that of the soul, but also for art, whose real purpose, understood in light of this prophetic teaching, is to support the contemplation of God. For beauty is God's radiance in the universe, and every beautiful work is a reflection of it. According to another prophetic saying of the prophet, God prescribes perfection in everything. And the word here is used ihsan, which is translated as perfection, also has the meanings of beauty and virtue. It is thus a duty of the Muslim to seek perfection in every work, this perfection implying beauty in its turn. The traditional practice of the arts refers to this maxim, and one will immediately understand on this basis there could be no schism between craftsmanship and art. And that's unquote. So it's a very beautiful exposition by T.S. Burkhardt. The production process from this point of view is therefore elevated or conceived of as a spiritual discipline in which what one makes is not only a means of livelihood, but also a product of devotion. As Kumaraswamy asserts, every man or woman is a special kind of artist. The artist is not a special kind of man or woman. And this constitutes a holistic work. And the question is not simply, therefore, what a person gets for his or her work, but what a person gets through that work. And this approach to making of things has always been closely wed to the spiritual practices of Islam, Christianity, or other religious traditions. And one's consciousness of one's mortality and complete dependence on the absolute or spiritual poverty is both a cause and effect of holistic work. Significant spiritual preparation involving prayers, meditation, and spiritual contemplation were therefore an integral part of the creative process for traditional Muslim and Christian craftsmen and craftswomen. Purity of soul and nobility of character were obviously indispensable for such works. The aesthetic aspect of work is thus fundamentally linked to the ethical production of products. From this point of view, there is no aesthetics without ethics. Moreover, when the spiritually realized individual participates consciously in the act of creating any object or art form, that person is fulfilling his or her potential as God's vicegerent by, in a sense, emulating God's aspect of creator. This is because the human being is created in God's image, and is therefore a work of art par excellence as a reflection of his divine names and qualities. So not only is there a profound resonance between knowledge and the creative act rooted in the human's role as a reflection of divine attributes, but there is also an inverse relation that exists between the creative act of God and that of the human beings. God's creative act or art results in the manifested order. It is an externalization, whereas the art of human beings is an internalization. And so the act of divine creation brings into existence that which is made by God, but the creative act of human beings is a sense of process that returns the maker to his or her inner essence, wherein spiritual knowledge is realized. While traditional Islamic arts reflect such principial knowledge and grace, high quality and beautiful products also reflect the love of the maker had for his or her work. One only need think of the beautiful Persian carpets. And I assume everybody here has seen Persian carpets before. They're quite beautiful in their patterns and colors. To understand that its makers put much more than the goal of economic gain into its weaving. Its production elevated the soul of both the maker and the user. The product made with such awareness enhanced the life of its owner through its beauty and significance as the manifestation of devoted artistry. Whereas makers of such art fulfill their spiritual needs immediately through their work, patrons fulfill their spiritual needs after the artifact is completed. Conversely, Patrons fulfill their material needs immediately through the purchase of this useful artifact, which fulfills the spiritual needs, whereas makers fulfill their material needs after the compensation for their work, allowing them to buy useful and beautiful artifacts in turn. And craftsmen and craftswomen living in the traditional Islamic civilization generate all such artifacts in the knowledge that to create something for people's use is ultimately to create that object for God, since each person is capable of being God's vicegerent on earth. Titus Burckhardt has another very wonderful illustration of these points through the following example. This is a little bit of a lengthy quote, but please bear with me. I think the quote is very telling and insightful. He says, "I knew a comb maker who worked in the streets of his guild, the Meshashim. He was called Abdulaziz, that's the bondsman of the Almighty, and always wore a black jalabah, the loose hooded garment with sleeves that you may have seen people in Morocco wear, and a white turban with a lithan, the vase veil, that surrounded his somewhat severe features. He obtained the horn for the combs of ox skulls, which he in turn bought from butchers, and he dried the horn skulls at a rented place, removed the horns, opened them lengthwise, and straightened them over a fire, a procedure that had to be done with the greatest care lest they should break. From this raw material he cut combs and turned boxes for antoon, which is an eye decoration, on a simple lathe. This he did by manipulating with his left hand a bow strapped around a spindle, causing the apparatus to rotate. In his right hand he held a knife, and with this he pushed his foot against the counterweight. As he worked, he would sing Quranic verses in a humming tone. I learned that as a result of an eye disease which is common in Africa, he was already half blind, and that in view of long practice he was able to feel his work rather than see it. One day he complained to me that the importation of plastic combs was diminishing his business. It is not only a pity that today, solely on account of price, poor quality combs from a factory are being preferred to much more durable horn combs, he said. It is also senseless that people should stand by a machine and mindlessly repeat the same movement while an old craft like mine falls into oblivion. My work may seem crude to you, but it harbors a subtle meaning which cannot be explained in words. I myself acquired it only after many long years, and even if I wanted to, I could not automatically pass it on to my son if he himself did not wish to acquire it, and I think he would rather take up another occupation. This craft can be traced back from apprentice to master until one reaches our Lord Seth, the son of Adam. It was he who first taught it to men, and what a prophet brings, for Seth was a prophet, must clearly have a special purpose, both outwardly and inwardly. I gradually came to understand that there is nothing fortuitous about this craft, that each movement and each procedure is the bearer of an element of wisdom. But not everyone can understand this. But even if one does not know this, it is still stupid and reprehensible to rob men and women of the inheritance of prophets, and to put them in front of a machine where day in and day out they must perform a meaningless task. And so I thought that was a very moving and insightful statement. So from this point of view, every member of society ideally engages in a vocational occupation corresponding to one's spiritual and psychological needs. So each one of us has a vocation, as President Kushner stated. This would allow every individual not only to best serve the society to which one belongs, but also to best realize one's perfections. As the Quran states, to each is a goal to which God turns him. And in Arabic, the noun there includes both men and women. Then strive as in a race towards all that is good, and wherever you are, God will bring you together. Moreover, Islamic law gives the social division of labor itself spiritual significance, based on the principle of what's called fard of kifaya. And this principle requires that some members of the community must practice each profession to discharge collective obligations to provide public and private goods for the rest of the community, including the buildings of orphanages and hospitals, for example. If no members of the community fulfill such needs, then each member of the community is held spiritually accountable. And similarly, if some members of the community practice each profession that fulfills everyone else's needs, then all other individuals in the community are absolved of that spiritual obligation. So you see how the two are going together, really, even in the division of labor. In short, the social division of labor is a spiritual duty, not simply a right. Unlike conventional economic theory in which the division of labor is impersonal and devoid of spiritual content, the division of labor relieves each member of the community of a particular responsibility before God, and therefore it generates mutual gratitude. And such spiritual needs transcend the material needs of society while supporting their fulfillment. In a sense, each member of the community gives and receives a spiritual gift to and from others, respectively, transmuting exchange into something far greater than the acquisition of material goods and services. But this spiritual gift is only realized through holistic work, since deformed work comprises the needs of the needs of current and future generations. The principle of fard kifaya in holistic work therefore has tremendous implications for mutual respect and appreciation, as well as the spirit of reciprocity and economic justice. A living religious intellectual heritage is therefore critical to realize such an economy. Only a functioning and intact orthodox tradition that informs holistic work through holistic science and technology based on metaphysics that contain within themselves the dimension of knowledge intrinsic to that tradition can perform or produce such works of enduring art. In traditional Islamic society, the formation of guilds transmitted the Islamic doctrines and practices on the division of labor, production, and market exchange that allowed men and women to live in harmony with him or herself, his or her community, and nature. And prior to the formation of guilds, identical principles were transmitted from master craftsmen and craftswomen to their disciples. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting the return to or a restoration of all the practices of historic Islamic models, but this history can serve as a source of inspiration for understanding how Islamic economic principles were previously applied and how we can apply them today to strengthen the aesthetic and ethical dimensions of contemporary economic practices. And as we'll see under the next question, that holistic work is going to be crucial to identify or to address the environmental crisis from an Islamic perspective. Unfortunately, these values are resulting from the application of Islamic economic principles are no longer as pervasive or strictly manifested in many parts of the Islamic world today, which is due, for the most part, to the penetration of secular modes of thought and practice in lands. In fact, prior to the late 19th century, nearly the entire gainfully occupied population of Islamic towns were members of the guilds. Basically, there was guild fraternity. And the guilds highlighted their religious origins with important implications for interreligious cooperation. Practically every guild identified a particular prophet or saint as being the patron of its particular craft, thus endowing the craft with something of the sacred character of the personage. So, for example, the carpenters took their patron as the prophet Noah. Having built the ark, he stands forth as the exemplary master carpenter. The Virgin Mary was adopted by the weavers as their patroness. It was she who wove the swaddling clothes for the child Jesus. The Persian companion of the prophet Salman al-Farsi, having been the prophet's barber, was the patron of the Barbers' Guild. The Caliph Omar was reputed to have said that he would have adopted the perfume making as his profession. If he made no profit, he would at least have with him always a beautiful scent. Hence his adoption by the perfumers as their patron. In fact, the common recognition of many of the monotheistic prophets of the Abrahamic family of religions encouraged the existence of interfaith guilds with Christian, Muslim, Jewish members, and fostered many harmony among many different intrafaith guilds in traditional Islamic civilization. There were thus links and cooperative arrangements among members within a particular guild, as well as among various guilds, where they all shared a common interest in the work they did, as well as the spiritual and economic benefits of performing such work with excellence. This approach to production and social organization entailed a system of personal exchange in which coordination between members was quite manageable. In fact, traditional craftsmen and women accepted the duty to supply their goods at just and stable prices, since the division of labor was a duty, not just a right. To avoid over or undersupply of the market at a particular time, for example, a master craftsman or craftswoman could postpone or accelerate taking on apprentices, while another craftsman or craftswoman had insufficient or excess work, respectively. In short, equilibrium in religious economies was critical not only for meeting the physical needs through reliable employment and steady income, but also for satisfying the guild members' spiritual needs by making possible the fulfillment that came from their participation in the deeper dimensions of work. Just wages and prices were essential to such a holistic economy. Merchants, master craftsmen and craftswomen, journeymen and journeywomen, and apprentices were entitled to earn enough to support themselves and their families. Just prices would eliminate what's now called economic rents, or unearned income, avoiding massive wealth on one hand and destitution on the other. In a sense, both modern and holistic approaches to pricing claim to eliminate unjust profits or economic rents, ensuring what economists call long-term equilibrium price. Do we have any economists or economics majors today? A few? All right. So in the context of holistic work, self-respect replaces self-interest. It transcends self-respect, transcends both egoism and altruism. Here, egoism is not in contrast to a sentimental altruism lacking in sufficient reason, but with the legitimate self-love that results from the right to exist and the duty to realize oneself spiritually. Love thy neighbor as thyself is to love our neighbor and ourselves equally, and not to feel obliged to give our neighbor what we think we would not deserve if we were in his or her place. The Catholic economist John Nadale clarifies this distinction between self-respect and self-interest as follows. Self-respect includes self-interest, narrowly defined, because every self-respecting person takes care of him or herself and his or her family. She does not allow them, if it is in her power, to become a charge on the charity of others, nor fall below a certain level. By the same token, a self-respecting person does not allow herself to be dominated by egotism or mere things, consumerism. Self-respect allows us to give due consideration to the higher order needs, that is, our need for love and belongingness, for competence and professional mastery, for independence and freedom, and finally our need for the pursuit of beauty and knowledge as ends in themselves. In a sense, self-respect is therefore based upon and reinforced by holistic work. Now, if these are essential features of that clock is not right. If it was 8:10, I'd be in a lot of trouble. So if these are essential features of an Islamic, Christian, or Jewish, any other traditional religious economy, what does this imply for a critique of industrial capitalism and communism, which is our second question? Let's consider this from the point of view of the environmental crisis. Economists generally view the environmental crisis in terms of market failures, that is, as results of the overuse or the underuse of goods relative to their true costs, and most particularly of the fact that natural resources like clean air, water, and a stable climate that should have a price, unquote, are considered free or are drastically underpriced. And we'll return to industrial communism in just a few minutes. And so a classic example of this that economists use this, to illustrate this price discrepancy is that of a factory polluting a nearby neighborhood and imposing costs on its neighbors that are external to the polluter who ignores its social and environmental responsibilities. A lot of times in the modern context, it can be understood as pushing costs onto the taxpayers rather than internalizing it to the firm. In situations involving such negative externalities, economists maintain that goods such as clean air and water are underpriced. The cumulative effect of this is market failure, the pollution of clean air and water without paying the cost of that pollution's harm to others. And so we live in a system where, unfortunately, where prices are a principal signal for guiding economic activities that often don't reflect the environmental values as poorly as today's prices do, then the system is running, in a sense, without essential controls. We're flying blind. And accordingly, markets can fail to account for the myriad environmental threats, including marine loss, deforestation, desertification, freshwater system decline, loss of biodiversity, proliferation of toxic pollutants, acid rain, nitrogen excess in fertilization, and so forth. So the increasing scarcity of unpolluted natural resources, most of which have been used or damaged by their use in production processes without cost to exploiting enterprises, reverses Adam Smith's well-known claim that an individual pursuing his or her own interest might be led, quote, by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his or her intention, nor is it always the worse for the society that it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than one he really intends to promote. And this is the basis of what might be called the separate domain argument in economics, that society, modern society, is made up of two spheres: an economic sphere of individual initiative and interaction governed by impersonal laws that assure a beneficent outcome of the pursuit of self-interest. That's one sphere. And the rest of social life, including political, religious, and moral interactions that require the conscious balancing of self-interest with social considerations. Am I making sense? These two spheres. One you don't have to take into account social considerations, the other you do to get good results. And really, in a sense, what economists are trying to do is to develop a system so perfect that no one needs to be good, as T.S. Eliot said. So the free exploitation of unspoiled nature, however, converts the benign invisible hand into a malevolent invisible foot, in which each person pursuing their own good will automatically and most efficiently do his or her part in maximizing the general public misery. So, to paraphrase Adam Smith's well-known known precursor of the theory that we quoted earlier, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual external costs of the society as great as he can. He generally intends neither to promote the public misery, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible foot to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it any better for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own self-interest, he really promotes social misery more effectually than one he really intends to promote. So that reverses the separate domain claim when we have negative externalities. Market failure and the invisible foot put a blinding spotlight on the need for reasonable regulation of markets and commerce, particularly in response to the heedlessness that treats environmental and social capital, the latter including social networks marked by reciprocity, trust, and cooperation, as though they were disposable income. But the political process necessary for proper regulation can also fail due to the corrupting influence of special interests. And from this perspective, the indispensability of effective regulation in the public interest, or the common good, which is very important here at St. Thomas, and at Xavier, it depends on lawyers, judges, policymakers, and public servants at all levels of government being trained to truly and impartially administer justice and to maintain their integrity in carrying out those duties. This is a particularly daunting challenge for politicians and regulators facing these really powerful and well-financed special interest groups. Now, special interests arise because small groups with mutual interests have a greater incentive to organize and lobby than larger groups do, since one's share in the goods produced diminishes as the number of stakeholders increase. So, for example, 10 people, if they're going to split $1 million, have an incentive to get together and cooperate to split the $1 million. But 1 million people splitting $1 million really don't. And so special interests can really become, a death by 1,000 cuts on the public. And so political failure perpetuates, indeed magnifies, market failure. Government policies could be implemented to correct market failure and make the market work for the environment rather than against it. But powerful economic and political interests typically stand to gain by not making those corrections, so they are not made, or the correction is only partial. Furthermore, the problem of special interests tends to worsen over time, since the longer economic disorders remain unremedied, the more special interests amass wealth and organize more effectively to protect their advantages. Am I making sense? So over time, this problem gets worse. And there are studies by political scientists, I think from the University of Chicago and Stanford, if I remember correctly, that basically analyze this, that if you put on one axis the percentage of people who are in favor of a piece of legislation and the percentage of people who are the probability of success of its passage, if we lived in a perfectly democratic system, we should have a 45-degree line. If 0% of the population supports it, then it has a 0% chance of probability of passing. If 50% of the people promote it, then 50% chance of passing. If 100%, then 100%. Anybody care to guess what the actual line looks like? Yes, please.
Is it a horizontal line at about 30%?
Exactly. It's that 30% line, which means that we live in a corporatocracy governed by special interests. We're not really in a democracy. They concluded the report that we have basically no say in what goes on effectively. And it turns out that about 2/3, on Capitol Hill, 2/3 of the time goes to campaign fundraising, not actual legislative issues. And so one of the most prominent examples of this is the fossil fuel industry, as Naomi Klein documents in This Changes Everything. In short, the ethical orientation and commitment necessary to prevent the degradation of both people and the environment is generally absent from both the economic and political domains in modern industrial countries where work is depleted of spiritual meaning. And efforts to remedy economic and environmental disorders are usually too little, too late. This is because modern science, I believe, and technology generate production processes that ignore the spiritual needs of laborers, craftsmen, and professionals for work that is ennobling. And that's why I suggested that work today is generally deformed as opposed to holistic. And Adam Smith acknowledged himself that deformed work was fundamental in industrial economies, but not without serious social costs. He states that the understandings of the greater part of men are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of people, must necessarily fall, unless government takes some pains to prevent it. Now, Adam Smith suggested that people just read poetry after work. No, nobody's going to have the energy or the capability to read poetry after a day on the assembly line. Now, what about industrial communism? I said we'd come to that as well. One might think that a socio-economic system based on central planning, explicitly appealing to cooperative ideals or the visible hand of the state rather than the invisible hand of the market, would be better equipped to neutralize the negative externalities that in systems lacking these characteristics. But in fact, the opposite is true, as evidenced by the dismal environmental record of communist countries, in addition to communism and many other life and freedom crushing effects. There's a scholar who basically argued that the ultimate cause of the collapse of communism was not the commonly cited yearning for democracy, human rights, and a higher standard of living, all of which had existed before. But it was communism's dismal record on the environment that was the final catalyst of the public consensus that the Soviet Union had to be dismantled and purged of communism. So that's one point of view. But regardless of how accurate that account may be, communism did attempt to achieve economy-wide cooperation through central planning, but undermined the basis for such cooperation by its approach to work based on its atheistic, mechanistic worldview that ignored the intrinsic connections between meaningful work and spiritually productive cooperation. Moreover, special interests can take on even more corrupt and dysfunctional forms in industrial communism than in capitalism, since bureaucrats tend to basically confuse their own interests and the interests of their bureaucracy with the interests of society as a whole. From this point of view, the complete lack of any spiritual dimension in communist political theory is bound to result in both massive market and political failure when put into practice. It is as though communism purports to achieve a sort of Christian charity without reliance on the inspiration of Christ or of any other revelation. As the renowned Catholic economist E.F. Schumacher, whom Dr. Naim mentioned earlier, explains, either you believe in God, then you will pursue politics, mindful of the eternal destiny of man and the truths of the gospel, or you believe that there are no higher obligations. Then you cannot resist the appeal of Machiavellianism. Politics is the art of gaining and maintaining power so that you and your friends can order the world as they like it. There is no supportable middle position. Those who want the good society without believing in God cannot face the temptations of Machiavellianism. They become either disheartened or muddle-headed, fabulating about the goodness of human nature and the vileness of one or another adversary. Everything is the fault of Khrushchev, Nasser, or Gates. Optimistic humanism, by concentrating sin on a few people instead of admitting its universal presence throughout the human race, leads to the utmost cruelty, unquote. So communism and industrial capitalism have a lot more in common than their proponents admit. Both neglect the loss of intrinsic meaning in production and exchange processes involving the higher objectives of work, thereby promoting conflict rather than cooperation between workers, owners, whether it's the individual corporations or the state, and consumers. Moreover, communism doesn't really even fulfill that material objectives of work that well either. Although communism does oppose spiritual values much more directly than industrial capitalism, they both undermine spiritual values. And for personal reform within a system is therefore rendered powerless to reform the system itself. And this is another quote by E.F. Schumacher. This is of decisive importance. It shows that appeals for good behavior and the teaching of ethical or spiritual principles, necessary as they always are, invariably stay, as it were, inside the system and are powerless to alter, unless and until the preaching leads to significant new types of work in the physical world. This is why E.F. Schumacher is the most important economist, in my opinion, from a religious point of view of the last century. Most economists believe that the transition from holistic work to deformed work was voluntary and consistent with laissez-faire, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, it was brutal. Basically, these incredible tactics were employed in Britain and other European countries in the early 19th century to force people into deformed factory work by depriving them of other means of support involving much more holistic, for example, agrarian work. These include the ferocious enforcement of what were called game laws that permitted the gentry to ride across small farmers' fields while forbidding farmers from leaving their land to game that might eat the crops, thereby destroying an enormous share of the total agricultural produce and imposing, just draconian penalties on the poor for poaching. In some rural counties in England in the 1840s, 30 to 40% of all male convictions were for infractions of the game laws. And as Rama Kumaraswamy notes, violations of the complementary poor laws in the 17th century prohibiting paupery became so prevalent that during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, men, if twice convicted of this crime, were hanged, and by the thousands. So to take advantage of a large prison population, Jeremy Bentham, who's a real character, proposed an improved prison enlightened for the maximum control of inmates in order to profit from their labor. And it's just unbelievable. Anyway, I won't quote him further on that. So I see I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to try to skip ahead a little bit and get to our third question. But the holistic theology of work outlined in our first question, along with the critique of industrial capitalism and communism outlined in the second question, have serious implications for economic theory. And this is because the separate domain argument no longer holds up. The separate domain argument doesn't apply to an Islamic or Christian or any other type of religious economy, because economic institutions are thickly embedded in spiritually significant non-market institutions. So the social considerations come into effect right away. So there's no separate domain there. And on the other hand, it doesn't apply to industrial capitalism or communism either, because it doesn't lead to beneficent outcomes. So the whole of economic theory really breaks down. And the economists' attempt to devise a system so perfect that no one needs to be good really fails. And so this is the reason why I believe that Islamic civilization, despite its tremendous economic activity, never developed the modern discipline of economics. So that's it. We'll take questions. This has actually a lot of other economic implications for the definition of economics, for the analytical tools of economic theory, and so forth, but we don't have time to get into that unless you want to talk about it in our discussion.